Ontic, Errance, Ontological Truth. It is all too easy to gloat over Heidegger's ridiculous attachment to his local roots, his "why do I have to remain in the provinces" theme. What if we conceive it as a kind of defensive strategy that enabled him to cope with the traumatic radicality of his thought? That is to say, what if we see in it a strategy comparable to that of Kierkegaard, who also showed up every evening at the theatre, and so on? It is impossible to endure the extreme effort of thought all the time. We have to have an easy place to escape to. Heidegger was arguably the philosopher of the 20th century, just as Hegel was the philosopher of the 19th. All subsequent philosophers, starting with Rudolf Carnap, have had to define themselves by drawing a line of demarcation, a critical distance toward him. The majority do not simply reject him. Rather, they maintain an ambivalent relationship with him, acknowledging his breakthrough but claiming that he was not able to follow it to the end, since he remained stuck in some metaphysical presuppositions. For Marxists, for example, Heidegger was right, in Being in Time, to perform the turn from the exempted subject observing the world toward man as a being always already thrown into the world, engaged in it. However, he was not able to locate human beings within the historical totality of their social practice. Mutatis mutandis, the same goes for Levinas, Derrida, Rorty, some Wittgensteinians, Dreyfus, even Badiou. Heidegger's greatest single achievement is the full elaboration of finitude as a positive constituent of being human. In this way, he accomplished the Kantian philosophical revolution, making it clear that finitude is the key to the transcendental dimension. A human being is always on the way toward itself, in becoming, thwarted, thrown into a situation, primordially passive, receptive, attuned, exposed to an overwhelming thing. Far from limiting him, this exposure is the very ground of the emergence of the universe of meaning, of the worldliness of man. It is only from within this finitude that entities appear to us as intelligible, as forming part of a world, as included within a horizon of meaning. In short, that we take them as something, that they appear as something, that they appear du cœur. To put it in Kantian terms, it is because of this finitude that intellectual intuition is impossible, that a human being can grasp things only within a gap between their mere being there and the mode, the as such, of their appearance. In short, that every understanding is a contingent projecting of a link over a gap, not a direct apprehension. The transcendental condition of possibility is thus the obverse of the condition of impossibility. The very impossibility for a human being to directly intuit reality, the very failure, falling short of the goal, is what constitutes the openness of the world, of its horizon. Being God is not simply all-powerfulness, but, at the same time, a claustrophobic closure. And not only that, the very notion of God is the result of a kind of perspective illusion, a projection of an impossible point of closure that can emerge only within the horizon of our finitude. God has no existence in itself. It is an appearance that has its place within the human universe of meaning. In other words, we should turn Descartes and the logic of the ontological proof of God's existence around. Infinity can emerge only within the horizon of finitude. It is a category of finitude. And, in effect, what Heidegger aims at in his assertion of finitude as the unsurpassable horizon of our existence can best be illustrated through the contrast to Descartes. Here is the famous beginning of Chapter 3 of Descartes' Discourse on Method, in which he outlines the necessity and content of the provisory code of morals that he adopted while engaged in the search for a new unconditional foundation. As it is not enough, before commencing to rebuild the house in which we live, that it be pulled down, and materials and builders provided, but as it is likewise necessary that we be furnished with some other house in which we may live commodiously during the operations, so that I might not remain irresolute in my actions, while my reason compelled me to suspend my judgment, and that I might not be prevented from living thenceforward in the greatest possible felicity, I formed a provisory code of morals, composed of 3 or 4 maxims, with which I am desirous to make you acquainted. The first was to obey the laws and customs of my country, adhering firmly to the faith in which, by the grace of God, I had been educated from my childhood, and regulating my conduct in every other matter according to the most moderate opinions. My second maxim was to be as firm and resolute in my actions as I was able, and not to adhere less steadfastly to the most doubtful opinions, when once adopted, than if they had been highly certain, imitating in this the example of travellers who, when they have lost their way in a forest, ought not to wander from side to side, far less remain in one place, but proceed constantly towards the same side in as straight a line as possible, without changing their direction for slight reasons, although perhaps it might be chance alone which at first determined the selection. Do not these first 2 maxims find an echo in 2 fundamental premises of Heidegger's ontology of finitude, the notion of our being thrown into a contingent but unsurpassable historical horizon, and the concomitant notion of an abyssal decision to which we should unconditionally stick, although it cannot be fully grounded in reasons, what critics usually reject as Heidegger's irrational formalist decisionism. It doesn't matter what you decided, what ultimately matters is the form of an unconditional decision, your fidelity to your choice, your assuming of your choice as fully yours. In other words, could we not say that we find ourselves in Heidegger the moment we fully assume and think to the end the fact that there is no transhistorical absolute knowledge, that every morality we adopt is provisory? Is not Heidegger's hermeneutics of historical being a kind of ontology of provisory existence? This is why the topic of finitude is inextricably linked to that of failure. Perhaps the ultimate definition of modernity proper concerns the status of failure. We enter modernity when failure is no longer perceived as opposed to success, since success itself can consist only in heroically assuming the full dimension of failure itself, repeating failure as one's own. So Sloterdijk was right when he observed, "Those who miss, in all this, an indication of Heidegger's modernity, should only recall the fact that, according to Heidegger, the decisive and destinal manifests itself also and above all as an assumed failure." When Heidegger repeatedly insisted in his later work that those who dwell in ontological truth necessarily err at the ontic level, did he not thereby acknowledge the irreducible parallax gap between the ontological and the ontic? Accordingly, is not the great Heideggerian political temptation to forget this gap and endeavor to impose an ontic order that will be adequate to the ontological truth? In his Schelling course of 1936, Heidegger wrote, "It is in fact evident that the 2 men who have initiated counter-movements, to nihilism, in Europe for the political formation of their nation as well as their people, that both Mussolini and Hitler are essentially determined by Nietzsche, again in different ways, and this without the authentic metaphysical domain of Nietzschean thought having an immediate impact in the process." The true problem of this passage lies not where it appears to lie, in Heidegger's all too mild critique of Hitler and Mussolini, which suggests a fundamentally positive attitude toward them, but rather in the question, what would a politics exposed to the authentic metaphysical domain of Nietzschean thought be? Is such a politics feasible at all? Similarly, the error of Heidegger's early work, until 1934, most directly discernible in his rectoral address, was that he believed it is possible to have sciences, the academic machinery, which will be aware of their ontological foundation and act at the level of this foundation. This was the goal of Heidegger's plan to renew the university, according to which philosophy would directly take over the guidance of particular sciences. After 1934, Heidegger acknowledged that the gap is irreducible. Sciences don't think. And far from being their limitation, this is their strength, the reason why they are so productive. The ultimate version of Heidegger's rhetorical inversion, the essence of X is the Xing of the essence itself, is to be found in his wartime course on Hölderlin's hymn Ister, 1944, where, in his comment after and on the Stalingrad defeat, he argues, ostensibly against vulgar Nazi propaganda, that the essence of victory is the victory of the essence itself, so that what really matters are not Ontic military victories, but the strength and ability of the German people to confront and endure the struggle at the heart of the essence of being itself, the antagonism of concealment and unconcealment. The ambiguity of such a stance was identified by Balibar apropos of Fichte. Does this mean that in order really, ontologically, to win, we have to lose ontically? Or that it is only the ontological resoluteness which will give us the true strength to preserve in ontic warfare? Along the same lines, we can also generate the Heideggerian statement that the essence of war has nothing to do with empirical warfare. Rather, it concerns the warring, Heraclitus polemos, of the essence itself, the discord, internal strife, of the very essence of being. But would Heidegger endorse the same reversal also apropos of the human essence? The essence of man has nothing to do with man as an ontic being. The essence of man is, rather, the humaning of the essence itself, the fact that the essence of being itself needs humans as the site of its being there, of its disclosure. And would he also accept, apropos of phenomena like Shoah, that the essence of suffering is the suffering of the essence itself? One of the standard Heideggerian defenses of Heidegger is to claim that in his later work he developed the thought which only enables us truly to grasp the roots of the Nazi terror in the will to power of modern subjectivity. Heidegger shows why the humanist rejection of Nazism is not strong enough, because Nazism is nothing but the extreme result of the very philosophy of subjectivity that sustains humanist ethics. This move, extraordinary in its rhetorical daring. People who risk their lives fighting fascism on behalf of humanist values are, in a deeper sense, solidary with its horrors, and, as such, more guilty than Heidegger, who is an active Nazi. Is suspect in its ambiguity. How come that if Heidegger enables us to gain a deeper insight into the roots of Nazism, he himself was not able to resist its lure? The standard answer is precisely because he was there, experiencing the extreme of modern subjectivity. He can formulate its truth. Does this mean that in order to gain insight into the truth of modern subjectivity, one has to go through a Nazi, or similar extreme, experience? Where exactly did things go wrong, then? Where did they take a fateful turn, in being and time? It is generally agreed that the focal point is the passage from individual to communal fate. But if fateful Dasein, as being in the world, exists essentially in being with others, its historical happening is a co-historical happening and is determinative for it as communal fate. This is how we designate the historical happening of a community, of a people. Destiny is not something that puts itself together out of individual fates, any more than being with one another can be conceived as the occurring together of several subjects. Our fates have already been guided in advance, in our being with one another, in the same world, and in our resoluteness for definite possibilities. Only in communication and in struggle does the power of destiny become free. Dasein's fateful destiny in and with its generation goes to make up the full, proper historical happening of Dasein. What follows is the famous passage on how, in its being thrown into the world, which confronts it with a concrete past, Dasein can choose a past hero and repeat his acts in a communally assumed fate. As Miguel de Beistegui has pointed out, this passage involves a whole series of displacements which are, in Heidegger's own terms of a strict phenomenological analysis, illegitimate. The passage is based on the analogy between individual being toward death, as the resolute assuming of one's innermost, possibility, in absolute loneliness. Only I can die for myself, and the community displaying the same attitude. But how can this be done if authentic death is uniquely my own, not shared? In what sense can communities also display the attitude of resolutely assuming one's fate in confronting death? How is the death of a community to be thought here? Simply as the entire community risking its destruction in violent confrontation with other communities? From the standpoint of the individual Dasein, such a death is radically different from the way Heidegger previously described being toward death. We are now dealing with the sacrificial death which cements a community. When, in The Origin of the Work of Art, Heidegger lists among the modes of putting into work of the truth, in addition to thinking, poetry, and state-founding, also the essential sacrifice, we should read this strange entry together with the passage from his lectures on Hölderlin from the same period, which specifies this sacrifice as the comradeship amongst soldiers at the front. Its most profound and only reason is that the proximity of death as sacrifice brought everyone to the same annulment, which became the source of an unconditional belonging to the others. The tension between this notion of death as sacrifice and the analysis of being toward death in Being and Time, where, in death, I am thrown back to myself, totally alone in my uniqueness, is unmistakable. As Beistegui points out, Heidegger's approach to social life is determined by an unthematized dominance of the notion of domestic economy, the closed economy of the home. When Heidegger talks about technology, he systematically ignores the whole sphere of modern political economy, although modern technology is not only empirically, but in its very concept, rooted in the market dynamics of generating surplus value. The underlying principle which impels the unrelenting drive of modern productivity is not technological, but economic. It is the market and commodity principle of surplus value which condemns capitalism to the crazy dynamics of permanent self-revolutionizing. Consequently, it is not possible to grasp the dynamics of modernity properly without what Marx called the critique of political economy. And this ignorance of the alienated political economy is by no means politically innocent. As, again, Beistegui points out, Heidegger shares this ignorance with fascism, whose ultimate dream is precisely that one can domesticate modern technology and industry, that one can reinscribe them into the frame of a new home economy of the organic state community. And what if Heidegger also overlooks the fact that the emergence of the Greek polis itself, this open space in which the community gathers to debate and decide shared issues together, is already the outcome of such a displacement, of oikos being reduced to an element of a larger encompassing order? The properly historical irony here is that Heidegger, in his focus on authentically assuming a communal fate, overlooks precisely the way in which the reign of anonymous market forces is experienced as the new version of the ancient fate. As Marx and Hegel repeatedly claimed, in modernity, fate looks more and more like the impenetrable and capricious socio-economic process. The collective result of people's activity confronts them as a foreign fate. Is it legitimate, then, to imagine a being in time without this fateful turn? A being in time which would simply remain individualistic, dismissing every collective experience as inauthentic, as the fall, and allowing only the individual's resolute being toward death as the authentic act? Or a being in time which would elaborate a different, more progressive notion of authentic collective existence, somewhat along the lines of, say, Walter Benjamin, who also spoke of revolution as the authentic repetition of the past. In 1937-38, Heidegger wrote, "What is conservative remains bogged down in the historiographical. Only what is revolutionary attains the depth of history. Revolution does not mean here mere subversion and destruction, but an upheaval and recreating of the customary, so that the beginning might be restructured. And because the original belongs to the beginning, the restructuring of the beginning is never the poor imitation of what was earlier. It is entirely other and nevertheless the same." In itself, is this not a wholly pertinent description of the revolution along Benjamin's lines? Should we then propose, as a mode of authentic community, that of the revolutionary collective, or a Pauline collective of believers, which in fact served as the model both for Heidegger's early work and for Benjamin? Is not such a collective precisely something which escapes the dyad of the closed oikos and the mechanical anonymous das Man of community and society? It is all too easy to succumb to this temptation of rewriting a good being in time, a temptation which should nonetheless be resisted. The passage from individual Dasein's authentic decision, grounded in assuming one's being toward death, to communal decision grounded in accepting one's destiny, in Being in Time's infamous section 74, is not as arbitrary as it may appear, since it responds to a very precise necessity. As Heidegger himself put it, resoluteness is a purely formal concept. It refers not to what you do, but to how you do it, and, as he laconically adds, the content of authentic existential possibilities are not to be gathered from death. Where then are they to be gathered from? This is where the reference to communal tradition comes in. They are to be drawn from the communal heritage in which Dasein's existence is caught up. In other words, it is precisely in order to avoid the standard criticism of decisionistic formalism that Heidegger has to pass from the individual to the communal.